welcome to our podcast on idioms. No, not idiots. That's a mean name to call somebody, but idioms. And these are basically figures of speech. So let's go ahead and see what we mean by this. We call them figures of speech because they are groups of words whose meaning is not what each of the individual words actually is. So this is kind of a problem if you are learning English, if you're trying to use a one-to-one translator, saying, okay, well, they use these four words and these four words together mean this. Unfortunately, that is probably not going to be what the idiom actually means. So an idiom is just a group of words or phrase that we as English speakers have agreed to allow to mean something else, not based on their individual words, but on their power as a group. For example, if we said that Johnny was really old and finally he kicked the bucket, it does not mean that he walked up, found a bucket, which is a container where you can put stuff in it, and then hit it with his foot. He didn't actually kick the bucket, which would be the literal translation. We agree that it means to die. I'm not sure where that came from or when was the first person to say that, but in English, when we say kick the bucket, we mean to die. Another example, to hang one's head does not mean to string somebody up on a scaffold and put a rope around their neck and kill them, to hang them. We mean to be ashamed. Someone hung their head in shame. Means that they screwed up, they made a mistake, and they were just dipping their head to acknowledge that they made a mistake. So here's some other examples with short explanations. If we say something is a piece of cake, we don't mean that it is actually something you can eat. We mean that something is easy. That test was a piece of cake. I could get all the answers without even thinking. It doesn't mean that you were served something with a cherry on top. It means that you had a very easy time while taking that test. If something is very expensive, it costs an arm and a leg. It doesn't mean that you have to pay for it by chopping off an arm or something like that. It just means that it's very expensive. And again, I'm not sure of the historical background as to where these terms came from. Maybe somewhere back in history, something was expensive and someone was able to pay for it by chopping off their leg or something. It doesn't really matter for the point of our class. But if you see something here that it costs an arm and a leg, you have to understand that the idiom is that it means it's very expensive. Similarly, in terms of your appendages, here's another one. If you are seeking to offer good luck to somebody in the theater world, you would tell them to break a leg. You would not say good luck. Again, not sure exactly why, but in the theater world, if you want to tell somebody to have a great show, you tell them to break a leg. Not literally again, but in terms of an idiom. Here's another one, letting the cat out of the bag. Now, if you are keeping a cat in a bag for some reason, that's probably pretty dangerous, maybe a little abusive. Feel free to let that cat out. But what we mean by this is that you are letting a secret out. So if you have some sort of surprise trip planned for your children and you don't want to let them know, you want to keep it a secret, you don't want to let the cat out of the bag because you don't want to reveal that secret. But once you're ready to reveal that secret, you are letting the cat out. And we use that as a synonym for letting a secret out. Another one here, hitting the nail on the head. Wow, that was a great answer, Johnny. You totally solved that problem. You really hit the nail on the head. Now, most likely, he's not in a carpentry class. He doesn't have a hammer and nail in front of him, and so it doesn't mean literally he's banging away at some sort of steel pointy object with a dull steel object called a hammer. No, it just means that he got something right. He hit the nail right on the head. We could go on and on about idioms in English. Here's some others to look at. If something isn't going to happen anytime soon, it's going to happen when pigs fly, which is the assumption that it never will happen. You can't judge a book by its cover, meaning you gotta read it to find out what it's really about. Maybe you bit off more than you could chew, meaning you took on a project that was too big for you. When it's time to go skiing or snowboarding, we might say it's time to hit the slopes. That does not literally mean to go out there and pound the snow with your fists in frustration, although for some people it might be. Basically, hit the slopes means go skiing or snowboarding. If it's time to get down and get to work, we have to put our nose to the grindstone. Just get focused, get going. And then the last one, if something isn't too far away, we say it's a stone's throw. Now, I can't throw a stone very far, but that doesn't necessarily mean you can only go 5 feet away. What we mean by a stone's throw is that it's relatively close. So that could be however you define close in terms of a walk or a drive or a bike ride or something like that. And so the point of all of these is that we have to look at them not as what their literal translations are in terms of what each individual word means, but we have to look at the overall understanding and agreement that we as English speakers make when we hear these terms. And so a great example of this is that we have a teacher in our school who is visiting us from France for the year. She is very competent in French and Spanish and English. She is a great learner of languages and teacher of those. But almost every single day, one of us in the office will say something that is an idiom, something that just cannot be translated. We'll say like, oh yeah, absolutely, that project was way too big. They totally bit off more than they can chew. And she will say in her French accent, what are you talking about? He wasn't eating anything. What do you mean he bit off more than he could chew? He was doing a project on mechanics or art or grammar. And so we have to explain to her, it's not a literal translation. We can't translate each word for word and get the same meaning. It's just one of these phrases that we just have to understand as English speakers. And so she is the perfect case in point as someone trying to learn this language as we do as native speakers. She's oftentimes translating words and it doesn't exactly work because as a phrase, it means something than the individual words within that phrase. Oftentimes on tests, we will see things like this, where these idioms are a little bit more subtle, and they don't become big phrases. You know, the ACT isn't going to test your knowledge of the phrase, when pigs fly. That's just silly. Who cares if you know that or don't know that? But they are going to test whether you can pick the correct pronoun for particular cases. For example, you might say, I often sit across from my sister on the bus, meaning she sits on one side of the aisle and you sit on the other. You would not say, I often sit across with my sister. You would not say, I sit across by my sister. You would not say, I sit across to my sister. The correct pronoun in that case is from. And so sometimes tests will ask you those questions. And so it's not so much about like when pigs fly, but it's about the correct pronoun choice for each moment. And again, it's not necessarily a literal translation from other languages. It's just one of these things that you know and you absorb and you learn by making mistakes with it. And so that's how we can figure those idioms out in English. So in sum, definitely be wary of idioms. So if you're seeing in some sort of reading passage something that just doesn't make literal sense, then it's probably one of these figures of speech. And so we don't want to try and figure out its meaning based on individual words and the translation of those. We need to go ahead and look at them as a group, as a unit, as some sort of figure of speech. And so when we are writing our papers, we also have to be aware of these idioms. Rather than use something flippantly like, yes, that was very difficult, I had to put my nose to the grindstone, we have to ask ourselves as a writer, do we overuse these? Are we being too silly? Are we being a little bit too informal for the piece we're trying to write? And so in a formal paper, we're not going to use idioms very often because they're not very formal. And so we want to make sure that we are A, as a reader, figuring out what they mean, and then B, as a writer, that we are writing appropriately at the right levels of formality, and that we are being more specific, and oftentimes these idioms are not specific. So just take a second look at those as you are reading or writing. As always, if you have any questions, go ahead and bring those into class. Thanks so much for listening, and we will see you soon.